All right, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, thank y'all so much and welcome to the inaugural LB's The Lover of Books Author Chat. Little housekeeping, right now, everybody is going to be muted but myself and the author. If you can stay muted during the interview, and then at the end, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions, and make sure that your name, whatever you want me to call you, is listed at the bottom. You can rename yourself, your Bookstagram handle, your name, whatever, and then I can call on you. To do that, just click down at the bottom for reactions. Then you can click raise hand, and then I'll know that you have a question. If you don't want to ask it and you'd rather me ask it, then just type it in the chat and I'll try to get to it as well. Also at the end, we're going to try to take a photo. So if you can turn your camera on at the very end, maybe have your book nearby for the photo. If you don't want that, just smile, fart, whatever you want to do for the photo. But I say we go ahead and get started. And thanks so much. Vera, I'll make sure she gets you highlighted and we'll get started from there. All right. Hi.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
You too. Thank you for having me.
Well, we want to thank Vera Kurian for joining us. She is an author and also a scientist. She has her PhD in social psychology. And just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been living in DC since the 90s. And my background is in political psychology, which is sort of like using psychology to understand political science or political attitudes or behavior. And I always just sort of wrote on the side as a hobby. I mean, obviously I'm into writing, but also like film, reality TV, horror movies, all kinds of stuff.
Well, what got you interested in this specific topic, in this specific book, which we're here to talk about, which was Never Saw Me Coming?
For one, I'd kind of been reading thrillers pretty regularly for the past 10 or 20 years and had been kind of frustrated by a long stretch of books which featured sort of hapless female unreliable narrators with spotty memories and sketchy husbands. And I'm sorry, my parents are calling me.
Tell them we said hi.
I didn't know how to turn that off on FaceTime. Okay. Hopefully they don't do that again. And I wanted to write a book that focused on a female lead character who was like very driven and smart and would ask follow-up questions. So I wouldn't have that frustration. And that I've always been a fan of true crime, but I had heard of a treatment facility for juveniles in juvenile detention who had psychopathic characteristics. And that one way of getting them to improve was not to, appeal to their morality because they don't really have it, but to incentivize everything in terms of personal interests. So, it's not the case, don't hit that boy because it hurts his feelings. Well, they don't care about that, but don't hit that boy because if you don't, then you get this reward, 10 minutes of TV time or whatever. So I thought about what if there was an entire school like that? And then I kind of narrowed that down to like a program for 7 people.
Yeah, I don't know how you would keep up with an entire university. So I think the seven people, it was perfect because we were able to keep track of them for one as readers. But it was also fascinating because they're not all the same type of psychopath. So how did you get in their heads and how did you find out? Because these aren't just, stupid people or sort of the cliche version of what we see sometimes. So how did you get there to get these, specifically the 5, 6 that we know of?
Yeah, so I'm, my background is as a literary writer, so I'm always going to be character driven. And I think what happens in a lot of books is that there's a person, if they have some kind of thing that's different about them, whether it's a mental illness or they're Black or they're gay or something, that becomes their personality. And that's actually not a personality. So everyone who is a psychopath or everyone who is depressed actually has an independent personality different than that. So, I mean, every single person in this book, I wanted to be a 3-dimensional person in as much as you can see them. So, they all have entire lives independent of being a psychopath, but they all also kind of think about it differently too and have a different approach to their diagnosis.
Absolutely. But with all those characters, and what drives them is a little bit different, and how they deal with problems and issues are different. What was your process? Like, how did you write this novel and keep track of their mindset in relationship to others?
So I had the initial idea. When I had the initial idea, if you look on my blog, you can see a Facebook post I made a couple of years ago where I was like, hey guys, I have an idea for a book. And then I basically said the entire book, including who did it. So I kind of knew the outline of the story. And the character of Chloe, I had like a pretty strong idea head on that she was like, very smart and intelligent and manipulative, but also she was like kind of lacking in self-awareness, in an almost kind of charming way. But when I started writing the book, she kept kind of saying funny things. So that became more of an aspect of the book, which I really liked over time. I always had like a fair idea of the plot. Some things change. So can I say a spoiler or no? Are we?
Can we? I will, but can you save it till the end?
Okay, yeah. So
that way I can sort of give warnings to people.
Yeah, I initially changed like a really major thing that happened in the book and like changed because there's two plot lines, right? And I changed how they interwove. But for the most part, I wrote the book very, very quickly because it was very sort of a propulsive story, and I deliberately wrote it to have short chapters because it keeps people reading like very rapidly. So that was just kind of the process.
Absolutely. How long did it take you to write it? And what is your writing process like? Like, we want to get inside your head now.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't advertise this. It took me 6 weeks, which is kind of abnormally fast.
That's
Normally
awesome.
takes me 6 months to write a book, but this just kind of like wrote itself. It was so fast. What was the second part of the question?
And sort of what's your writing process like?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, did you just like sit down for a day, days at a time?
So I go to the gym at like 7:30. So I would write from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. And then I would write a little on the weekends. And that's typically what I do. I mean, I do try to talk about that a lot because people make it seem like, if you have a day job, which 99% of writers do, that like it's so hard, you have to wake up at 3 a.m. And that's not really true. You just have to like use your time very efficiently. And that doesn't come from nowhere. I mean, I've been writing since like 4th grade. So I've kind of figured out how to do what it is that I want to do. And I've written and published a lot of short stories before I wrote this book.
So you have a day job during the day and then just write on your off time. What was the COVID, the global pandemic, how did that affect your writing this novel, publishing? Just give us an idea about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a wild story. So this book was written and revised, 2018, I think to over a year. And then I had an agent and we were working on revisions. So typically you revise with your agent and then you go out on submission to editors. And so I had finished that final draft the first week of March 2020. And then I talked with my agent. I'm like, oh, what do we do? I mean, this COVID thing seems bad. So we decided to not go out on submission, wait for a couple months. And then it did get picked up like right away. So the entirety of like putting the book together, so the editing with my editor at Park Row, the publicity plan, the marketing plan, all the meetings, like all of this was done like virtually and online. I didn't actually get to meet my editor or agent until that like bump of freedom before the Delta variant.
Right.
So, I mean, literally, this was like a pandemic book, essentially. And in the meantime, like many writers, I didn't do very much writing during COVID because it was just too emotionally taxing. I did some work on plotting my next book. And then now that things have gotten better, I've gotten back into the swing of writing pretty regularly.
You mentioned you had an agent pretty early on, and that's when you did your revisions. How hard was it to get an agent so that, people here may not know what that process is like either?
Getting an agent is like a nightmare. It's if any of you are single and on Tinder, it feels like that, where it's just like you're constantly being rejected all the time. This is the third book that I queried. Querying is the process you go through to get an agent, where essentially you're cold calling. You send a letter, cold email to like a stranger being like, do you want to read my book? This is the third book that I've queried. So I had queried over 300 agents by the time I got, over the course of 3 books before I got to this one. So I had been rejected by, it felt like every agent in New York for my first book. I mean, that's an exaggeration. It's not true. So I really lucked out, and I just happened to get the right agent at the right time, and who's like a really good match for me. But it's a very harrowing process because you have to be able to deal with a lot of rejection, and a lot of writerly artist types find that very, very, very hard.
So a pretty thick skin, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the humor part of Chloe, and I extremely enjoyed that. Like, I found myself chuckling sometimes and sometimes busting out laughing at her reactions or things she says or her observations. So what was your intent in bringing in humor? Did it just sort of sneak in? Was it purposeful? How did you work that?
Yeah, it was not on purpose at all. It's just that when I was writing Chloe's character, she's kind of snarky and judgmental. And that came out right away. So then when I'm in her head, I just kind of run with it and be like, just like the diction she uses to describe things is kind of like unusual. And, she would say something like, I need to, at the very end, she says, he's made a powerful enemy. And like, no normal person says that. So, I mean, even when I read the book, I still find parts of it funny. And if any of you have listened to the audiobook, the narrator, Brittany Presley, does such a good job of switching between Chloe's like outside voice and her internal monologue. And I think it's quite funny.
Well, she knows
so myself.
She knows how to turn it on, right? I mean, that's a good distinction. I did not listen to the audiobook, I read it. So tell us what that process is like. Did you get a choice in choosing your narrator? Okay.
I got to pick from 4 or 5. And because I don't really know who dictates this, but it was going to be just one narrator and not like one narrator per point of view. Yeah. So I really wanted someone that could, of course, do the Chloe parts, but also do the other parts and do them justice. And Brittany had won a bunch of awards, and she just won the Audie this year for Mary Kubica's book, Local Woman Missing, I think. So she's just a really solid narrator. And like you could tell she had fun with it too.
That's awesome. How did you choose your types of psychopath, right? Because you had to decide who was going to be in this novel and how you were going to highlight them. So can you talk about your main characters? And because we don't just get Chloe's perspective, we get Charles, Andre, some of the other ones. So tell us about that.
So I wanted there to be like different types of psychopaths, and like of the ones we see, Chloe's just kind of like off on her own, but then you have, one person who's kind of not really engaged in the social world, like at all. You have someone else who's just like the worst human being that's ever existed, Trevor, who's just like based on research I did about incels, to be honest, and Gamergate, if you're familiar with that. And then the character Charles, I wanted this like foil for Chloe, who would also be a love interest, who's sort of a strange person, like not a standard frat boy you'd meet at college, but sort of like play acting like an adult almost. And then I wanted this counterpoint between like, because Chloe and Charles are so like extreme, and then I just wanted Andre to be like this normal kid that most readers would kind of latch on to, be like, he's the person I identify with the most because he's the most normal, and that there would be some kind of humor to that fish out of water juxtaposition between this like regular kid who's like a little nerdy, and then these two like extreme individuals, and then putting them all together in like a Scooby gang, essentially.
Yeah, well, it was interesting how Andre stepped into their sphere, right? Because although he's done research himself and really delved into this true crime world, how easy would it be for someone to fake out a professor at Adams University, because he really seems to fool him and his assistants.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing about if you've ever been to therapy, the therapist is assuming you're not lying when you say, I'm sad and I cry every day. They have no way of knowing. I mean, but like in 99.99% of cases, like why would someone fake a mental health issue? I mean, there's a really famous, I wouldn't even call it a study, I think it was more of a stunt, I think like old-timey 1900s, where people went to an asylum and said, I hear voices. And that's all they said. They were committed. And then they tried to get out and said, like, we're actually journalists. We wanted to see like if you would commit us. just from saying we hear voices, and they were like, oh, you have delusions that you're a journalist, so you have to stay. So I mean, the reality is, I don't think it would be that hard. The actual thing that would happen in real life is if you had a psychopath and you were asking them these self-report questions, it's a fair probability that they would just lie the other direction, not the direction of saying they had it, but that they didn't have it.
Well, what was your research process like to, I mean, obviously you did a lot of school
Yeah.
in this, but was there anything specific that you had to do to prepare for this novel?
Yeah, I mean, so my background wasn't really related to clinical psychology, but my background kind of helped me to be able to read research that's not intended for like everyday readers, but for scientists. So I mean, I read a couple of pop psychology books about psychopathy, but I have the Handbook of Psychopathy, which is like a compendium of articles written by experts who study psychopaths. So I read quite a bit of that, and that should try to make sure that it was an accurate representation of the diagnosis, which I do believe it is.
Yeah, I mean, I listened to another interview, and the woman that was her area of expertise, and she was so impressed with what you did that it was a true representation of psychopaths, and it wasn't just some, over the top or fake. It was a true, like I said, a representation, and I felt it was so believable, and it kept me, like you said, those short chapters just kept me going. But I did have a question about psychopathy. You talked about the hereditary part of this, and then, but we didn't get the alternate side. So can you tell us what you found, what could possibly be the cause of this illness?
I think a lot of psychologists approach things like this. I think it's called the stress diathesis model, where there's a component that's genetic and there's a component that's environmental. So if you have a genetic predisposition from schizophrenia, it doesn't mean you're 100% likely to get it, but maybe if you were in a very stressed environment at a critical time point, then you would get it. So I try to show some indication of like, or maybe, particularly with Charles, you see someone like where his family is very messed up, and
Very abusive.
kind of makes you wonder, is his father like that? Is it genetic? He was raised in this environment. Like, to what extent did that have to, factor into it? And we don't know actually anything about Chloe's family. She just doesn't talk about them. But I did want it to be clear that it's neither entirely one nor the other.
Yeah, we only got that one little snippet about, I think it was from Dr. Wyman's perspective, I guess, when he was talking about her mother and that she was fearful of Chloe. And then that was just sort of piqued my interest as to what that background was like.
Yeah, I'm like a firm believer of when you're sticking in a point of view, you have to follow the rules of that character. And Chloe just doesn't care or think about her mother at all. Like, now that she's free in college, I think the only time she would contact her mother is if she needed money or something. And to be honest, if you were Chloe's mother, she would be a nightmare. You wouldn't really want to spend that much time with her.
She was entertaining for us, but yeah, I could see that college sort of probably let her mom take a deep breath for a little bit at least.
Yeah.
Now, one thing, the event-based could be her rape, right? And so you did talk, one thing I thought that was important is that you discussed rape shaming, and it wasn't a long mention, but was that an important topic that you wanted to address?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to imply that event changed who she was as a person, but there was no way for you to know that she was like just born with psychopathy, probably. But I was thinking a lot about the Brock Turner case, and very much when I was creating the Will character, I didn't want Will to be like a Ted Bundy type. I wanted him to be like a very banal form of evil. That's not even the right word. Of like, if Chloe had tried to make this into a court case, I think his parents would be like, no, he's a good boy, you're ruining his life. And I specifically wanted it to be like that. We know if he only did this once, just to be like, this is a thing that conceivably a boy could do once and be like, well, I'm not a bad person, right? So, and I was thinking a lot about the people's reaction to Chanel Miller and like other sorts of cases like this, where attempting to blame the victim in order to salvage the reputation of the boy involved. And I think there's a lot of like female rage floating around the zeitgeist because there is not a satisfying conclusion to many of these such cases. A lot of people reading this book really wanted Chloe to kill Will. Some people, that made them feel uncomfortable. Some people were just like, I'm wholeheartedly cheering her on. And then a small percentage of people were like, murder is wrong. So depends on who you are.
Well, I think almost anything's game when you see psychological thrillers. So you kind of have to know that it could get twisted at any point. So
Yeah.
Now, when not only did you just really go into rape shaming, but you really discuss social media and how that can have an effect on people, negative, positive, how it can be used to your benefit and against you. What are your thoughts on that, and how did you want to use it in this book?
I think that, like, definitely in literary fiction, there's a reluctance to engage with technology. I mean, there's just starting to be like a spate of internet novels now, and I'm just always interested in the internet as like a cultural thing. But like young people, or even people my age, like are kind of like living on the internet, and like social media would be a huge part of that. A lot of people are oversharing, which then makes it easy to find out things about them if you were to be stalking them. And like someone like Chloe is really savvy to use these things for an advantage, in terms of like curating the perfect vision of yourself, or stalking someone, or you know, flirting with boys. Or there's, you know, a couple parts where with Trevor you see the way it can be used to, I mean, I think cyberbully is underselling what he does to people, like cyber attacking essentially.
Oh, yeah, he ruins lives with a push of a
So
finger. But
gross.
well, it was just, so many books now, when they don't address it, it almost seems like it's not set in the right time frame, because it does. It's part of all of our lives. And so if it's not mentioned at some point, it's kind of like, are you really in 2022 or
I think
2020?
it's a desire to make a book seem timeless, but it just ends up being, well, you end up raising questions of like, especially if it's a mystery, you're like, a normal person would just Google this
Right.
clue to find it out. And, you know, in mysteries and in horror novels, it's just kind of inconvenient that people have cell phones. But the reality is people live on their phones, so you kind of need to
Right.
have them in the room.
I must say, I did Google CRD. Was there any inspiration behind
Yeah,
that particular character?
the BTK killer, if you remember him, Dennis Rader, the bind, torture, kill. He was a married man with children who was a Sunday school teacher and did these like horrifying murders. But also Ted Bundy, being a serial killer that was really prolific. So I wanted that CRD character to be a similar type character, except in the DC area.
And why did you pick DC in particular? Just because that's where you live, or was there the protests obviously that helped pull in
Yeah,
DC as well?
I live here, and you know, I love the city, and it's like a lot of books that take place in DC are about politics, and people don't understand. Like, people always refer to Washington as if it's like all the senators and House of Representatives is like living here, and like you don't understand, like actual people live here who have nothing to do with politics. But also a lot of depictions of DC depicted as being entirely white, when it's like actually extremely diverse, which is why I wanted a Black main character in there too. And then I just wanted to throw in a lot of like actual references to people in the area who they would recognize.
And you mentioned Ted's Bulletin, which those
Yeah.
Pop-Tarts are delicious, and it made me. I don't live there anymore, but I enjoyed that little snippet right there.
Oh yeah, the milkshakes are what I
Yeah.
would go there for.
I also liked the spidey sense that you talked about, that women get when they have that feeling of, they're scared, nervous. But then you compare it with Elena, with afraid that if she admits this or tells someone this, that she'll be accused of lazy thinking, because it's sort of a catch-22 for her, right? She wants to appear smart and educated and thoughtful, but then again, she doesn't want to put herself out there too much with this inner feeling. So was that something intentional?
Yeah, I mean, she thinks that about Trevor, who's one of her clients as a therapist, and I think there's your professional self, but then there's also, for all women, there are just times where you get that feeling
Mhm.
of something is just like profoundly creepy and you can't shake it. But I could imagine someone in her position trying to talk herself out of it and being like, this is prejudice that I feel this feeling, but the reality is like she's probably on point because he's just such a terrible person, and she might not fully have access to all his terribleness because we only see it because Chloe like snoops into his room and stuff. We don't necessarily know if he says any of that stuff to Elena. I mean, I know as the author, like he doesn't.
Right. But we just know
So
warning bells have gone off for her. She just doesn't quite
yeah,
know why.
yeah, exactly.
Um, if, so many of these characters are so smart in how they present themselves. Chloe, she can be the girl next door. She can be the drop dead gorgeous, bombshell. And then you have Will, who obviously uses his looks and charm to get what he wants. With that, did you find a difference from reaction from men and women and how they saw this book and their reactions to how they basically were using their bodies to get what they wanted?
Yeah, I think most of the readers of this book are women and gay men. So,
Okay.
I mean, have had feedback from like a handful of presumably straight men, and I think that the reactions, Will, are less on the gendered aspect of it, or more on the whether or not they sympathize with Chloe. Because like some people were like, "Oh my God, she's so funny! Like I think it's great that she murdered a rapist," and other people are like, "This person is a terrible person, therefore I don't like her." Or more extreme, "These are terrible people, therefore I don't like the book." Which I feel like
Okay.
you're missing the point if that's your
Right.
thing. But I think some people just don't want to read about bad people, and other people like kind of revel in it. So it's
Yeah.
really more of a personal preference.
What, so this whole process is, them recruiting these psychopaths into the university to try to help them adjust into real society. How do they react to certain situations? How do they have relationships? Do you believe in this process, and do you believe it could be successful or to a certain extent, or where do you
So
go?
independent of like there's no program like this at a university, but the actual process described in the book, my understanding is yes. Because this was based on like kind of real research, there are people trying to pioneer a treatment that does work um, for psychopaths. And I talked to a professor at Georgetown who works with psychopaths on a program to help them get better. And I asked her, like, can they actually improve? And she said, the ones that really want to can, if they're willing to put the work in. But the issue is that a lot of them don't want to.
Okay. And does that change over time? Like, in other words, like Will has a definite want to have a relationship with his girlfriend,
Charles, yes.
to be accepted into his family,
Yeah.
and so there's a want and a need there. But also, a lot of college kids, myself included, were very selfish at that time in
Mm-hmm.
our lives. I mean, it's just how teenagers and 20 somethings work. So I'm curious to see if that professor, what age group that they worked with, and if maybe that could change when they get older, when maybe interests have changed.
Yeah, I think there's a general thought that personality disorders improve over time. If you were to consider psychopathy a personality disorder, I think that's debatable. But there's a general understanding that they get better over time, that you like kind of mellow out when you get to like, I think your 30s and 40s. Um, and from what I hear from these research studies, that does look like that's the case. So the idea would be to have an intervention when they're younger and like kind of more malleable before they start like getting in trouble, potentially like ending up in jail or something. And that they could be learn more adaptive behaviors younger.
Well, so much of Chloe's issue, I think, was impulse control, right? That's what gets her in trouble a lot through the novel. Um, how did you get inside their heads and sort of decide what she's gonna, I mean, because obviously when she has the geode and, you know, and
Yeah.
she's constantly, that inner dialogue is going back and forth, and she'll talk herself out of it sometimes. And so
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, first of all, I loved Chloe. I'm a pro Chloe. So just give us your thoughts.
I think one of the problems is when people want to write a strong female character, they'll often default to writing a woman who's perfect. Like she's Wonder Woman, like she's super strong and like really smart and beautiful and this and that, and basically has no flaws. And like, that's not, they think they're doing something feminist or something. The reality is that people are like three-dimensional. So I wanted Chloe, yes, she's very smart, but she like clearly has impulse control problems. She's unaware of this, but she's totally lacking in self-awareness. And like is not capable of being self-reflective in a way that Charles actually is. I think there's a point in the book at some point where she says like, I don't have many flaws, but one of them is like total hubris or something. Like she will make mistakes because she thinks, like, for example, going into that basement alone, it doesn't really occur to her that that's like a really dangerous situation. Well, if anyone's trying to kill me, I would be able to fight them off, but like that's not true. So each of these people is someone who is flawed. You can see it kind of better with Charles, that he's been through this program and has learned some of the characteristics. Like the one time he really loses his temper, he's like trying to calm himself down before he makes an irrational decision. He manages to do that successfully. He still has some impulse control, as we see.
Yeah. Does do his migraines, is that something that was related to psychopathy, or is that something that's just related to him?
No, the reason I did that is so that I wanted there to just be like a ton of red herrings in the book, so that people go, oh, he kind of like blacks out, so maybe he did it.
Yeah, like
but the reality
like, really,
is that
like alternate personality when he goes off. Yeah.
Yeah, and I knew that there would be some percentage of people that would think that Chloe did it, but had split personalities or something crazy like that. So I did actually get some feedback from a few people who suffer from migraines. They're like, I never see myself in fiction. So that was kind of nice.
They're represented.
Yeah.
Now, you also address death penalty in this case and restorative justice. What were your thoughts on that, and how did you want to work it into this book?
Yeah, I've actually written about the death penalty before. I have a novella about two brothers going on a road trip to see their father be executed on death row, and kind of their differing thoughts on that. But I think I wanted to create Wyman to be this person. What sort of person would start a program like this? And some people read him through most of the book as being very sinister. And the reality is of like, given his connection to CRD, and he is of the Quaker faith, where they don't believe in the death penalty. And I had read an article about, I think it was Sidwell Friends School. It was a Quaker school where a teacher, in the midst of doing a lecture, kind of made a joke and did the Hail Hitler sign. And then it became this big thing, and everyone was talking about it, and he got fired. And then other people at the school were like, wait a minute, we're Quakers. Like, we don't just do things punitively. We believe in restorative justice. And I thought this was a really interesting concept, kind of morally and religiously. So, the whole reason he starts the program is actually extremely benign. He defended this terrible man because he wanted to help him. And then he starts this program because he wants to help people. But in the end, he ends up being kind of played by everyone.
Yeah. I mean, he does have good intentions, and I do agree. I mean, at times you're questioning him. So kudos to you on that too, because it's not totally clear where he is, where he stands. And I liked the mystery behind him. Okay. I have to know, the MRI scene, is that possible?
Yes, it is possible.
Okay. Describe for the readers, because this is, cool.
So there's a scene where someone is murdered by being forced to drink buckshot, which is the little pellets you see inside a shotgun shell, which are metal, and then goes near an MRI, and then the buckshot comes out of them. So it's like the reverse of being shot. I have a few friends that do social cognitive neuroscience, and I asked them, is this plausible? And they were like, yeah, technically. And a few people questioned that. I was like, no, I talked to experts. You were not supposed to wear metal. You're not supposed to. There's been like a couple of deaths where some kind of terrible accident happened involving metal and an MRI. I mean, I hate MRIs, so I find them kind of terrifying. So I always thought that was like a interesting way to die.
I would say so. Now, everybody here may not know, but I've recently found out when you're in this writing process, kind of changing gears, that a lot of authors get sensitivity readers to look over their book before it goes out. Did you have any experience with that with this novel? And if so, what was it like?
Yeah, I had.
I guess tell them what that is, first of all.
Yeah, a sensitivity reader is if you are not part of a group, but you're writing about a person of that group. So if I'm writing a Black character, or someone's writing about someone with a disability that they don't have, that you get a sensitivity reader to basically make sure you don't say something idiotic and offensive. It's something I have a lot of thoughts about, because one sensitivity reader might have like a completely different perspective than someone else. So I did use sensitivity readers for because I was writing a Black character and I'm not Black. But it's something like writers are talking and thinking a lot about, because in my next book, there's a character who's Indian and I'm Indian, and the character's parents are both doctors. And someone's going to get angry about that and be like, that's a stereotype. Like, did you get a sensitivity reader? Well, if I was sensitivity reading someone's book and they had that, and it wasn't done in a offensive way, and the person actually understood that Indians are disproportionately doctors, like as my parents are, it's really complicated.
Right.
I actually think a lot of it boils down to how good you are as a writer, because a bad writer is a sort of person to just rely on a stereotype to characterize someone. So yeah, it's a whole issue. It's a whole can of worms.
Yeah, I saw an interview with Joyce Carol Oates, and she had an experience where she was like, I don't care what you say, this is staying in. And I'm glad she did. She stuck up for her point and wrote through it. And it was very interesting, because there's sort of a pro and a con to this type of reader, right? Like, you have your author's voice, and you want a safety net, right, to make sure like you're not doing something stupid, but you really also want it to be your book and what your perspective is.
Yeah, it's hard because there are a lot of writers who have put their feet in their mouths, but there's also a lot of readers who are like, someone on Book Talk who's quite famous posted a thing about my book and she loved it, and where she just kind of said the premise of the book, and then all these people started being like, sounds ableist, how ableist? And I was like, well, none of these people have read the book, and like actual people who are experts in psychopathy were fine with the representation in this book. So why were you defaulting to thinking that I had done something ableist? So I mean, a lot of this is like, and a lot of it is, depends a lot on the individuals and like how complex their representation of that minority group is.
Well, switching gears a little bit again, what was your favorite part about writing this book and the experience, and your least favorite part, not necessarily of writing, but just the book in general, like this whole journey?
Yeah.
This is your debut author, so this is all new for you.
Yeah, I will say when we went on submission to find a publisher, it was the 28th of May. That was the week the George Floyd protests started. It was during the federal lockdown for COVID. So I was alone in my 600 square foot apartment for weeks at a time. I was not seeing my friends because I hadn't formed a pod with them then, because I was like terrified. So I was in a very isolated situation. And then I got a phone call, that this went to auction. And I told my friends, and they came over to meet on the roof. I hadn't seen them. They met me on the roof. It was like, we literally have to see each other, even if it's dangerous. And obviously this like brought me joy, but the thing that brought me more joy is that just telling people the good news, and they were like, this is the only good thing that's happened this year. Like, this is the only thing keeping me going. So, I mean, that was like over 2020 was like such a bad year that to look forward to something in 2021 was like really, really kept me going through a very difficult year, and kept me focused on doing an activity that will lead to something positive in the future.
Yeah, it was your light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, that's
Yeah.
and it shows how much it affected not just you, but all your loved ones and your support group around you. That any good news was, the best sparkle of any day in
Yeah.
2020. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
Were there any hard, difficult parts of this book's journey?
I think the really hard part is like when your book comes out and you realize that some people aren't going to like it. And that some people are like super harsh. Because at first I was like reading all of the Goodreads reviews, and then you do realize that there's just like a terrible, terrible thing. And then there's people that seem to like willfully read your book with bad faith or have like really bad takes on it. And then it took me a really long time to just kind of accept the reality is I don't want to be friends with every single person on earth. And odds are the sort of people that like this book are my kind of people, and the sort of people that hate it are not my kind of people. And if you look at, I was like obsessed with what my rating was on Goodreads, and like it started out at a 4 point something, and then it slowly went down to like a 3.6 or something. And I was like obsessed with this because I was a good student. A 3.6 is like a B, So I talked about it with my publisher and my agent, and I was like, I'm really concerned about the rating. And they're like, oh, we don't care. Like books with polarized ratings sell better. And I was like, oh, yeah, the reaction to this book is pretty polarizing.
Well, I think you're right. I think that you have to set healthy boundaries, right? Because Goodreads can be pretty poisonous if you
Yeah.
are looking at people that are out to get you kind of. But I found so much joy in this book. I found it a fast read. Thank you, Elaine, by the way, for recommending this to our book group. And my mother reads about a book a day, and
Oh my
this
God.
is not her typical genre. And I told her, I was like, Mom, I'm doing an author chat. You need to read this. So she got it. And she's like, oh my gosh, thanks for making me step out of my bubble. And she loved it. Like,
Oh,
so kudos. Yeah, she's a retired high school English teacher, and
oh.
yeah, you passed. I think you would have gotten an A for that one. So don't worry about your B on Goodreads. Um, all right. So I did notice on your blog you have a book countdown, and you talked
Oh,
about a little bit that
yes.
writing. So what can you give us anything as to what you're working on? What's coming?
Yeah, I'm working on it's not a thriller, it's more of a mystery about
Okay.
that has some kind of supernatural elements. Which is really an homage to Stephen King's It, but it's not a horror novel, but it's about a group of high school kids in the 90s, which is when I was a high school student, who witness a mass murder that is somehow tied to this megachurch in their town. And that summer of 1995, they end up killing the pastor of that megachurch. And then they have to come back 20 years later because he is somehow still alive. Um, and so it's a dual timeline where there's a mystery in each timeline that they are kind of trying to figure out. And is a big book. So I think I'm like maybe 30% done.
Okay.
I don't know if it's been announced. I guess I
Okay.
can't say when it's coming out.
Okay. But it has been same publisher. I mean, are you
Yeah, I'm still with
okay?
Park.
Okay. Tell us, you mentioned Stephen King, but are there any authors that as soon as they put out a novel, you're reading it?
Oh, I mean, Elena Ferrante, if you haven't read My Brilliant Friend, that series, like literally stop what you're doing. Every woman on earth should read those books. I think she's a must buy. I really like, I might be pronouncing her name wrong, Evie Wild. She wrote the Bass Rock. I don't know if it's a Bass Rock or the Bass Rock, but she also wrote All the Birds Singing. I believe she's Australian. She's just like a really fantastic writer. She's an auto buy for me. I just really love Cloud Cuckoo Land, the new Anthony Dower book. I didn't like his first book, and I like this one a lot because it's a very Cloud Atlas like. So those were some recent ones I really liked.
Do you, I assume, because you said you like true crime, do you also like TV? I mean, do you delve into this sort of genre on TV movies, or is it strictly fiction podcast?
No, I mean, well, yeah, I like a long serial podcast about one murder, like those sorts of podcasts, and then probably I do consume a lot of like, someone does like a mini series about an actual murder, or like some kind of like thriller type, like Pieces of Her, which is on Netflix, that sort of thing. I consume a lot of TV, so it's not specific to mysteries or thrillers.
I love Karen Slaughter in particular, and
She's great.
oh, she's fantastic. And would love to see more of her stuff on
Yeah,
the
I don't know
screen.
why
Like,
all her stuff isn't adapted, and like
like
she
Grant
writes
County is
very,
made for it. Yeah. I mean,
yeah, she writes these incredibly harrowing, sometimes very like, graphic novels. And then if you look on her Instagram, she's really into Catterday and will post all these
yes.
kittens.
It's so
Really funny.
bizarre. Like, okay, I guess she has her cats to sort of balance the.
Yeah.
But when my mom again recommended Karen Slaughter to me, and she's like, "You haven't read this?" And I said, "No." So I started it. Thank goodness, with Grant County, because if you don't and you start later, it kind of messes it up.
Yeah.
And then I loved it so much because, like what you said, it's so character driven. I mean,
Yeah.
her descriptions, and that's what I think drew me to this one, because there was so much character. But what I do get in trouble for is if I don't recommend how graphic she can write. Some people are turned off by that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't bother me, but it can others. So I just don't think she does it just to do it. I think it's always with intent. And I appreciate that with you as well. Like it was just enough, to
Yeah,
get the
and it's
point
like
across.
I grew up watching incredibly violent horror movies, so like I don't find the MRI murder to be like horrifying, but like I'm sure some readers find some of the content disturbing or graphic, but that's kind of subjective.
Have you had any conversations about this book being adapted into any sort of film, TV?
Yes,
Oh,
the
tell
rights
us.
were picked up in July of 2020 by Universal in a preempt. My understanding is they are shopping it like this month. So like a production company pitches it to a studio that would put it out, like Netflix or HBO, like that kind of thing. So the idea would be for it to be a TV series on a streaming network as opposed to a movie.
Are you interested in being involved, like with the writing of scripts, or would you be like, I've read where Frederick Bachman, I don't know how he says, is like, no, I've done my part, I've turned it over, let them be creative. Like, sort of, where would you fit in?
I told them I wasn't interested in writing because I don't have a background in screenwriting, but that part of the negotiations is to get the author as much as possible. So I have an executive producer credit on that. So it would be as much as I wanted to. So like I could interact with the showrunner and that kind of stuff. But if so, I could do it if I wanted to, but not if I don't. But I would still get the credit.
Do you have people in mind? Who's your Chloe, your Andre, your Will?
I don't. In all honesty, like I don't know the young actors these days.
Okay, Dr. Wyman then. No.
Dr. Wyman, I exactly pictured in my mind. God, what is his name? Not Richard Dreyfuss. The guy who played the dad on Empty Nest. Richard Mulligan. That's exactly how I pictured Leonard Wyman. Everyone else, I just kind of have like a vague idea in my head, and it would be a really, all of those roles. There are so many roles in this book that would be so fun to play. Even the minor characters like Chad, who's one of my favorites, and like Trevor would be like really fun, and the twins.
Yeah, they were very interesting, but I don't want to give too much away. So you mentioned some authors. I just want to ask one more question before we go to the group, to the chat. Any books you're reading right now or that are upcoming that you would want to tell us, hey, give this a shout out and to recommend for us to read?
Yeah, I'm a really weird person. I read multiple books at the same time. So I'm reading Dune because I saw the movie. I'm reading Deer Season, which is one of the Edgar nominees. So I was nominated for the Edgar, so I'm reading all the competition. So
congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. I'm reading the audiobook, which is another Edgar nominee called Suburban Dicks, which is kind of like
that one.
Yeah, and it takes place in New Jersey. So I was like, I kind of recognize some of the places. So I have that audiobook. And I'm reading a Japanese translation called A True Novel, which is a Japanese retelling of Wuthering Heights. And then I read there's probably a few more, and I read like a little bit of each day.
Well, we just want to say congratulations. I mean, to be nominated for a debut American author for the Edgar Award is huge, and that's
Yeah,
a big bonus. And you got a glowing review from the New York Times. I mean,
I know
that's stellar. I mean,
that was a
so
biggie. A lot of these, because a lot of COVID has felt like sort of like a dream. A lot of these
mhm.
things haven't really quite felt real. So it's I,
Oh, we lost you. Your volume.
okay. It just muted randomly suddenly.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm extremely happy with the New York Times coverage. Way more coverage from them than the Washington Post, and I live in DC.
What's up with that?
I don't know.
Well, I think it's had a successful run. I'm going to continue to tell people about it, and
Thank you.
because I think it's a great read. And we're going to go. Does anybody have? Let's go to the. Anybody want to ask a live question before we get to the chat box? If you want to, remember click reactions and raise your hand. If you want to ask it out of the chat box, or I can go back and ask. Anyone? All right, let's see what's in here. All right, Kelly. Oh, sorry. Let's start at the top. If now there may be spoilers in this, people. So if
Yes.
you don't want to know, mute. All right. Heather wants to know: was Megan a psychopath?
In my opinion, no. I mean, most people think that serial killers are psychopaths, and most serial killers are not, because you would need a lot of impulse control to be a psychopath, to plan things out and not get caught. Sorry, to be a serial killer. So she's not okay in her brain, but she's not a psychopath.
She has other issues. That's just not one of them.
She has serious issues.
All right. Kelly wants to know: was there a true crime writer that influenced you, and were you able to connect with them with questions, especially I guess during COVID, right? Because you're sort of cut off from.
Yeah, I mean, Anne Rule's book about Ted Bundy, The Stranger Beside Me. If you don't know that story, she was a crime reporter, but also worked at a suicide hotline, and she was friends with Ted Bundy, and those murders started happening, and she got assigned a story to write about the murders, and then a little bit was like, did my friend Ted do it? And she writes this book about her experience, and it's like a seminal true crime book. I also really liked I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which is God, her last name is McNamara. Megan McNamara?
I think that's right. She was that series came out. Did you watch that?
Yeah, it's great.
She's HBO maybe?
Yes, and she's the author who passed away before the book could come out. And then the guy got caught. So
After,
and I think a lot of it was the work that she put into it too. That's a really good one if you haven't read it.
Absolutely. I hear that there's, just to follow up on that, with connections to authors, that there's such a tight community amongst genre writers. Have you had the opportunity, because you're new into this world, although you wrote short stories or articles, have you been able to connect with other authors and sort of make these bonds that we hear about?
I think through there's a couple of different groups. There's Crime Writers of Color, there's the International Thriller Writers Association, and there's also every year there's a group of on Facebook for that year's debuts for adults and then for young adult children. And it's been an incredible community of people helping each other out. And there's so many authors who like went out of their way to shout out my book and invite me to things and stuff. And now that things are like a little bit getting back to normal, I can finally like meet these people in person at like, conferences and stuff.
Awesome.
If any of you are going to the VA Book Fest next weekend, I will be there with I think S.A. Cosby and one other author and a few other people.
Now, S.A. Cosby, that's Razorblade.
Yeah, Razorblade Suitcase.
Okay. All right, so let's go. Ronald wants to know, did you have any input on the cover? And I did see it's the same for here in the UK, which is unusual, right?
This is almost the same for the UK.
Yeah.
And it's because actually the UK team saw the US cover and they're like, it's just so good. I think you don't get control of it. And there's good reason for that, because sometimes you see authors who do get control of their covers and you're like, what were you thinking? Marketing knows what they're doing for a reason. I mean, I just spent like an hour on Canva to try to figure out how to make a little like cute little marketing. I was like, no, people do this for a living. So I was sort of like anti putting a person on the cover. And I definitely didn't want one of those covers where there's like a woman looking behind her in the shadows.
Yeah.
But when I saw this, I just, even though there was a person on the cover, I thought it got the mood so right. And like, I liked the color palette of it.
Yeah. The ombre.
Yeah. So they want your approval. They want you to like the cover. But there are some publishers who just like aren't very nice. And they're like, we're putting this,
doesn't matter what you say kind of thing.
Yeah, it really depends. Like I have a great team at HarperCollins, so they really cared about my input.
Well, I just thought it was so unusual because most of the time when I'm, connecting with UK readers, I'm like, what is that book? Oh, that's such and such, because it's so different. And it's kind of crazy to think that across the pond, the opinions would be so different as far as the book cover. But yours is so translatable.
For example, in the UK, they like the strapline. That's like a really important thing for them. And I'm starting to get to look at the foreign editions of my book. So I've seen the cover for the German version and for the Netherlands, and they just have totally different styles depending on the country.
That's so cool. All right. Sonia says, I thought it was fascinating that the killings in the novel were done predominantly by non-psychopaths. Was that intentional?
Yeah. I mean, Chloe, well, yeah, guys, I guess Chloe kills two people.
Yeah.
but yes.
One was, but what was cool about hers was she was given the choice to step out and get away with it, right? Like I don't know that she really would have, but they were all given the option if they would kill someone else, then they would be able to walk away. But she didn't.
Well, if you believe Megan, I mean, I think
right,
Megan
if you believed
to kill everyone, yeah,
that she might be able to walk away. But anyways,
yeah.
Was there any?
Well, that was my thought about that most there's a study in that book I was talking about where they analyzed the case histories of a bunch of famous serial killers and came to the conclusion that only one clearly met the bar for being a psychopath, and that was Ted Bundy. If you know anything about Ed Kemper was not on that list. If you know what he's done, it's kind of like shocking that he's not a psychopath. But
was that Mindhunters?
Yes, he's the very big dude in Mindhunter. Like the guy who's like 7 feet tall.
The fact that he narrated more audiobooks at the beginning of audiobooks blows my mind.
He does the audiobook for Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews. If you know.
Right. How creepy is that, right? Because
extremely creepy.
You have all these blind people that wanted access to books. Oh, you're listening to a serial killer. Read your novel.
One of the worst serial killers of all time. Yeah.
Right. That's a great series too. I liked that one.
Yeah.
All right. Get back to the topic. All right. Elaine is curious about your character development process as an author. Do you meet real people who you want to model characters after? Or is it the opposite?
No, it's always like a completely whole cloth of my own mind. And you usually have like some sense of like who they are. The very first thing I saw for this book was this scene where Charles walks in on Chloe. She's doing something she shouldn't have done. And I saw someone doing something, I didn't know what it was, and then him walking in on her and then having a weird reaction to it. But sometimes it's just very like systematic. Like for the book I'm writing now, I spent the month just like there are 6 main characters. So I just spent the month like filling out questionnaires and looking at horoscopes, all kinds of things to just like fill out who these people were before I even started plotting the book.
Greensboro Public Library, where I am, they brought in Jason Mott, which was fascinating. He was a great interview. And someone asked him the same question, like, do you use real people? He said, not really, unless it's like just a random, oh, they got killed on the highway, and they'll never know that I held that grudge that long. So like, but he said it's no one particular, but I thought that was kind of funny.
I just got this book.
Yeah, I'm excited. All right, Sonia wants to know, isn't it true that a very large number of powerful people in this country appear to have traits of psychopath?
I mean, they say it's somewhere between 1 to 3% of the American population in total, with a disproportionate amount represented in prisons and at the top of corporations. If you think about the traits you need to get to the top of a corporation, seems to make sense. There's a book called The Sociopath Next Door, and another one called like Snakes in Suits. The latter is written by one of the biggest researchers of the topic, where he talks about the corporate world and how a lot of these traits seem to like align with psychopathy, that in order to succeed, you need to be kind of cutthroat. So, I mean, not all psychopaths are criminals. So a lot of them are just, if you think about it and you read the description, like you probably know someone who is one, but is not, there's just kind of like walking around in your normal life.
So like on the spectrum, they're high functioning, and is what you're saying, kind of.
Yeah. I mean, they're, they never, maybe they haven't killed anyone or committed crimes, but maybe they have a string of friends and relatives who no longer talk to them.
Makes sense. Ronald, who works for the Greensboro Public Library, said he's going to add your book to the book club set. So what they do is they order a big number of books so that book clubs can check out the books all at once and read
that's a
them.
good idea.
Oh, it's fantastic. And that's how I met Ronald. So, hey, Ronald. So that'll be exciting for Greensboro.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we have a lot of fans in here. Really quickly, I just want to thank you. First of all, we're to the end here, for joining us. And please follow Vera on Instagram, her blog. She has, some things coming out. And I think you'll find out all the updates there. If you don't mind, follow Facebook, the LBs, the Lover of Books. That's where I am on Facebook. And also on Bookstagram, I'll be the Lover of Books. And hopefully we'll have more author chats to come. Vera, I'll message you if you have any authors that you think might want to do this. We'd love to help get their name, their books out, help especially debut authors. But really, it's just an exciting way to find out more about a novel, and it gives you more of that personal connection to it. Everybody, if we could take a picture, if you don't mind, if you'll turn your cameras on. Well, our admin's gonna get us all. Can we get the big view? Anybody? Cameras? We'll see if they'll do it.
Okay, just let me know when to screenshot it.
Okay. I'll put my book up and we'll.
All right.
Well, kind of a bad screen, but all right, y'all, smile.
Okay. Hold on one second. Sorry, no, hang on one second. Okay, ready? Where'd it go? Okay. All right. And 3, 2, 1. There you go. Got it.
Awesome. Well, again, awesome. We think you're awesome. And we can't wait to read some of your recommendations. And we wish you the best. Good luck with the Edgar Award. And I'm sure there's more great things to come.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. Have a great night.
Night all.
Bye, everybody.